People were poor. They were probably, many of the people were immigrants. And we lived on a fourth floor walk-up. It was Depression. And my father worked for the WPA at that time, which the government put together for people who needed to work because there was no work. And I grew up knowing that there was a need for social justice, that there was a need for finding answers for people. And so I would very early on, my father was a union organizer. So very early on, I was involved with him. He would take me, I was the eldest of 4 kids. So he would take me with him to meetings and to demonstrations and to all kinds of things of this nature, so that I learned to do this. And this is what I was ingrained in our house, that you treated people well, you were respectful, that people were more important than the system itself. So it was a different way of growing up. And my folks spoke Yiddish. And I went to this Yiddish school, so all of this together. And the whole neighborhood spoke Yiddish, I think. When Dave and I married and we went to Brooklyn, where my folks still lived, and he said, nobody speaks English. I can't speak to these people. I don't even understand what they're saying to me. So it's really a very interesting way of growing up. And the Depression. When I was out of high school, I didn't go to college. Because again, as I said earlier, it was a Depression. And it was more important for me to see if I could get to work so I could get a winter coat. I didn't have a winter coat until I was about 18 or 19 because we didn't have any money. And so I finally found some work. I also played the violin. So I went to work while I was still in New York, I went to work in a settlement house. And I worked, a little patchking around in the office and so on. And so I could get violin lessons from them for nothing. So I did that for a while. But I left New York when I was about 20, early 20s. And I went to Cleveland to live. And that's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I went to Cleveland, and I got a job because the war had started. And I got a job in a United Electrical Workers Union. So I became a union organizer when I was in Cleveland. And I worked what I did was to organize women primarily who worked in General Electric, Westinghouse, and General Motors. And I traveled the whole state of Ohio and organized women. And I came, after about 5 years of being in Cleveland, I came to Chicago to work once again for the United Electrical Workers Union. Didn't accept the job because they wanted me to replace another woman, and I wouldn't do that. And I had said to them, if you wanted to fire her, you should have done this before I got here. Don't use me as a reason for doing this, and I'm not going to do it. So I didn't. And as a result, I went to work in an office for the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers Union. And in that period, I had met my husband, who was a labor lawyer, and we married. So I married David, and I had 2 children, stayed home for a while, and then went to work because a friend of mine needed help. She was the head of a laboratory in a United Health, which was also part of the union, was a laboratory of healthcare, part of the union. And she asked me to come and help her. And when I had a housekeeper would come in, I would go down and help her answer the telephone. And she taught me how to be a lab technician. So I became an on-the-job trained lab technician. Then I became on-the-job trained, as I used to tell people, I'm on-the-job trained everything. I was a union organizer, now I'm a lab technician. And I worked at Jackson Park Hospital as a lab technician for a number of years. It was kind of fun, and I was a chemistry technician. Would you believe that? a chemistry technician. I didn't even go to college. But it was a kind of, by rote. I learned by rote. And it was fine, and it worked. And it worked fine. And we moved from one area to another. We moved from the south side to Evanston when my daughter was going into high school. And I stayed home for a year, and I thought, this is getting very boring. This lunch stuff is getting very boring. And I was called to work at Mount Sinai. And the reason I was is that the person who was the medical director of the ambulatory care facility at Mount Sinai used to be my boss when I worked in that health center. And he called me and said, I need help. And I don't need help in the laboratory. I need help for somebody who's an organizer. And you need to come and help me. And I said, well, Herb, I'm not sure I want to do this. He was a doc. He was a wonderful guy. I'm not sure I want to do this. He said, come and look. So after he nudged for a while, I went and I looked, and I just said, well, they wouldn't hire me. I had an interview with the chief of the executive of the institution, and he wouldn't hire me because I didn't have a college degree. So I said, well, I'm not going to get a college degree in the next 20 minutes, so I may as well leave. Didn't even know where Mount Sinai was, as a matter of fact. When I came out, there was a ticket on my car. So you can imagine how I hated Mount Sinai at that moment. And I left because he said he wanted somebody with a college degree. And he really also said he wanted a man. And that was a time when I suppose you could say that. And so I left, went home. We left for a couple of weeks, go on vacation. It was the summer. When I came into the house, the phone was ringing. And so that it was Dr. Abrams again saying, I got it worked out. You just come here. You don't have to work for me in the clinic. Just come to Sinai. They need you. And again, it was an organizing thing. And I went back, and I worked in the admitting office. I got a job, they gave me a job in the admitting office, which was fine. What I wanted to do at that point was to learn. I knew about the medical technology, I knew about doctors, I knew about how people function, but what I didn't know is the business end of a hospital. So I was perfectly happy to take the job because that gave me an entree into exposing myself to another part of the institution that I knew nothing about. So I did that, and it worked. And when the chief executive officer left, and they hired another chief executive officer, he interviewed all of the lower rung administrators, and I think I convinced him that he really needed me, that I knew what nobody else knew. I knew every part of that institution because I had made it my business to know every part of that institution. And so I worked for the I worked then from the laboratory and the admitting office. I went to work for the chief executive as his administrative aide. And when he left, after 2 years of being in the job, it was an interesting experience in the sense that he was non-Jewish. I don't think he had a clue. And this was a board of young Jewish men. And I don't think he had a clue of what it meant to be Jewish and why they were there when it was an institution that really didn't serve a Jewish population. And it was starting to change, severely change. And he didn't get it. Well, he couldn't get it. He really couldn't get it. He was a very nice guy, but he couldn't get it. And so that it became almost that I was his interpreter. He would say something and somebody would say, what did he say? And I would say, he said, and he meant, and it didn't work out. It just didn't work out for him. And he knew it, and they knew it. Excuse me. And he, finally, between them, they decided that he would leave. And now they started the process of looking for a new chief executive officer. I sat on that committee, and they interviewed many, and they finally landed on someone. They hired another doctor, and at that point I said to the board, because he had not yet come, he wasn't coming until the fall, now that you've hired someone, I'm leaving. And why would you be leaving? Because I decided I didn't want to be an alter ego to another person. It didn't make sense for me. So they told him that I was leaving, that I wasn't going to be there when he got there. And he said, then I'm not coming, because I expected her to be there and do the work. I don't intend to work that hard. So they gave me the job. Would you believe it? I got the job for much, much less money than he was making. But as my husband said when I was being, very angry about that, he says, what's different? You don't need the money. Let's go get the experience. Do it because you want to do it, not because of the money. And I did that. And that's exactly what I did. Sinai is and was a very important institution for the Jewish community. While many didn't understand that, because they'd say, well, they're not serving Jews. Why is that an important institution? Well, the fact of the matter is they were serving Jews. Maybe they weren't serving Jews on a hands-on basis, but I believe that Sinai was and is a bridge to the African-American community and to the Latino community because Jews do serve people who are in need, not only your own people, but others as well. So I always felt that what we did at Sinai, that while we served the African-American and Latino community, we also were there and able to serve the Jewish community, as a bridge, as a tzedakah, as a understanding of social justice, but also that when the Jewish Federation needed to serve the Russian community as they came into Chicago with healthcare, Sinai was there to do it. And so I think this was a full-blown coming home of the whole issue of social justice as a Jew. And that was very important to me. Well, I was kind of proud to be appointed to the Federation Board. I really wasn't sure that ever that could happen. And it was wonderful that it did happen because it not only enabled me, again as a Jewish woman, to integrate into an organized relationship, but also the fact that as a member of Mount Sinai staff, that they would find that an important link. So I think I succeeded in making Mount Sinai a Jewish bridge, and that it was recognized by the community. And as I said, it took many years for us to get there, but I think it was important that it happened that way. So I was very pleased and very honored to have been appointed, because it meant Mount Sinai made it. They've arrived. People understood that it was an important institution to the community. It took 10 years. It took 10 years, I think, of very hard work to make people understand that Sinai was an important hospital, that it was a good teaching institution, that its doctors were first class and took very good care of people, that we did research. It took 10 years of work. And how did we do that? What we did was that it was important for me and my staff to integrate itself into the community, so that everyone on my staff had to be a member of some organization within the community. We had to join. Now, for instance, across the street from Mount Sinai, there was a housing project. It was important that we envelop this housing project and work with the women in there so that we could give health care across the street, which we never did. And then, as a result of being a part of not only other organizations within the community, whether it was housing, whether it's jobs, whether it was women issue, whether it was healthcare, we were a part of it. We also went to the churches to speak to the church groups about Sinai, but conversely, we also went to synagogues that were not in the community. So that, again, that was that bridge we built between our community, the Jewish community, and the non-Jewish community. So this was really a very important function that we undertook. And people started to talk about Mount Sinai as an institution that belongs to us, which I thought was, again, took us a long time to do that. We also, on a statewide basis, with the state financial and the public aid and Medicaid and Medicare, that we convinced the powers that be at a state level that Mount Sinai was an integral part of an institution that, to the state, if Mount Sinai were not there, that there would be whole communities without health care and without the ability to survive. And we convinced that. We convinced the state of that. And I think it holds even today. The state understands that Mount Sinai could never go out of business because it was an important institution to the state of Illinois, and that the Jewish community held it as an important institution. So I think that's what made it survive. I remember saying to Dave, when I became the chief administrator of Mount Sinai, how am I going to deal with this? What if somebody pickets? And he said to me, no, that's not an issue. He said, you've already made the decision. When you become the chief executive officer, you've made the decision of what you're going to do and what's going to happen if there were a strike of any kind. So he said, you have a decision to make. You will either do that or you quit. But you've made that decision. In 1959, there was a move to organize hospitals in the city of Chicago. I was at that time still living on the south side. I think I may have been working at Jackson Park in the laboratory, or I may have been the personnel director at Jackson Park at that point. And I got a call from the union asking me to help them on that strike that they had at Mount Sinai. And I think Michael Reese. And I said, no, I would never do that. I said, why would you choose the only 2 Jewish hospitals in the city of Chicago to strike and leave everybody else alone? I said, I would never help you to do anything against Mount Sinai. And I didn't even know Mount Sinai at that point. Do anything about Mount Sinai or Michael Reese, so count me out. So I worked for Mount Sinai for 25 years and left when I was 68 to go work for the county. They had recruited me because one of our board members was a friend of the new president of the county board. And she asked me to meet with him. And I said, what's the purpose? She says, he wants to talk with you. So I said, well, I'm not going to go work for him. I said, I'm ready to retire. She said, I know, but go talk with him. And I did, and of course, the rest is history. I went to work for the county. And I had left Mount Sinai because I was 68. It's time, for somebody else to take over. And I believe when I got there, there were 6 ambulatory care clinics. And it became clear to me again, as a social justice issue, that people were without care, that many people schlepped all the way to county hospital, living all over the city, and it was a wrong way to deliver health care. And together with my staff, and we decided to open more clinics in neighborhoods where people needed care and weren't able necessarily to get to county hospital. I left county with about 29 ambulatory care facilities. We had opened in many areas where where healthcare was hard to get. We now had doctors and nurses and other personnel serving those communities. Were very exciting, very expensive, very costly, so that, but however, they didn't no longer had to come, even though they came to the emergency room, there was nonetheless this important clinic that they could go to. In addition, it was a time when AIDS and HIV was rampant, and our infectious disease doctors came to me to say that they felt that HIV and AIDS could be well handled on an outpatient basis rather than putting them into the hospital at a very costly measure. And with that, we built, together with Rush, a 60,000 square foot building on Harrison and Damon to handle the HIV, AIDS, and other infectious diseases, and it's still there. And it's a fabulous facility. What it did was that it enabled us to take care of hundreds and hundreds of people with HIV, AIDS, and other diseases, infectious diseases, without putting them into the hospital. And it is today one of the most outstanding facilities, not only in the community, but a model for other places in the country. There was at one time a Jewish hospital administrators group. It was not a formal group, it was informal. It was all of the institutions, Jewish institutions throughout the country, where the chief executive officers got together and met once a year and to discuss the issues, problems, what common problems each institution has with the other, and so on. In 1972, when I became the chief executive officer of Sinai, because you could only be the chief executive officer to go to that meeting, the invitation came, and I decided, well, that's something I should do. When I got there, the first meeting was I should tell you, we only went to warm places. God forbid we should go where it's cold. And everybody brought their spouse. So I get to the meeting in Miami, and I discover that I'm the only woman. They discover that I'm the only woman. Didn't make them happy. So I get to the hotel. In the morning, the meeting starts. Everybody goes and has their own breakfast. So I go into the dining room and I see one or two of the people I recognize, and I want to sit down, and they kind of turn their head. So I don't sit down. I'll go to the meeting, and very clearly they're not happy with me. They don't know me, but they're not happy that I'm there. And the meeting goes on, and they spend a weekend, and on the Sunday morning before the end of the meeting, they have a thing called show and tell, where they tell everybody how wonderful they are. And they went on. I left, and I said to Dave, I'm not going back to that meeting. these people really don't like me. He says, well, we'll see. We'll see. The next year, they have the meeting, and it's in New Orleans. You see the pattern? And we get to the meeting, and the same thing happens. However, Dave's having a ball because the women, they love him. They love him. So we're in New Orleans, and we have the meeting, and it's very interesting. One evening, as Dave and I are walking back to the hotel, a whole group of these guys and their wives are coming the other way because they're going out to dinner together. But they never invited me to go. So I became friendly with some of the wives because they were so excited that I was there as a representative of an institution. So in the course of the day, I think it was Saturday, I left the meeting to go upstairs to my room, and as I'm going, I get on the elevator with one of the wives, and she says, "Are you loving this meeting?" I said, "No, I hate it." She says, "What do you mean you hate it?" I said, "Judy, your husband is a bastard." She said, "My Stewie? How could that be?" So I told her what they were doing. And I went about my business, went back to the meeting, and Sunday morning, when they had their show and tell, Stuart, who was the chair of the meeting, said, "Before we tell each other how wonderful we are, if Ruth would tell you what she thinks about you, it would be very interesting for us." He said, "Would you do that?" I said, "Of course." And I told them what they had done and how ridiculous it was, because my institution was as important as a Jewish institution as theirs was. And probably, as a matter of fact, in retrospect, we've still survived at Mount Sinai. Many of these institutions have closed or merged, and we did not have to do that. So, in effect, we were an more important institution in some ways than they were, even though they may have been bigger and had been there for a longer time. So anyhow, I told them how I felt about them. They were very chagrined, I have to admit. I have to also tell you that they changed. They were wonderful. After that, they also hired women. And when I came back the next year, they said, "We hired a woman to be our chief operating officer," and how exciting that was. So in a sense, it was wonderful. And at one point, I became the chairman of that group. That there was discrimination against Jews in New York. And getting a job as a Jewish kid, Jewish girl at 17, was very difficult. So I decided that maybe I ought to say I wasn't Jewish and get a job. I didn't tell anybody, and I did that. And I went to work in a law office. And first, I wasn't very good at it, I do have to admit. And I said I wasn't Jewish. They asked you. The agencies that placed you asked you if you were Jewish, because if you were, they wouldn't send you. And I said I wasn't. And I went to work in this law office. And listening to some of the other girls, and they were talking about what church they went to, and I couldn't stand it. In fact, I had told my father, and he was furious with me, just furious. And I finally went to sitting there at lunch one day. I said, "I don't go to church." "What do you mean you don't?" "Everybody goes to church." I said, "Well, I don't." And they said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "I'm Jewish." You could hear a pin drop in that room. I was fired. At the end of that day, I was fired. I became very, really captured in the 1967 war. And when that happened, both my husband and I changed our whole thinking about Israel. There was a call, for a need for arms, a need for money, a need for, that this was the turning point. I remembered that for Israel, either they were going to be there or they were going to be gone. We became much more concerned and much more involved. And at that point, I went to Israel, and we made a decision that we were going to give as much money as we could to the Jewish Federation. And it started at that point for me. I felt that being a Jew meant that you helped others. I believed that being a Jew meant that you did not have to believe in organized religion to reach out in the whole arena of social justice. I believe that being a Jew meant you fought against discrimination, not only against Jews, but against anybody. Because if you discriminated against anybody, you discriminated against Jews. So that was the way I was brought up. And that's what I believed almost my entire life. Now, it's very interesting. I go to synagogue on the high holidays. I do. And why do I do that? And friends of mine say, yeah, why do you do that? That's so out of character. Well, it's really not out of character. Because I feel, I go and people say, well, why do you go? What does it mean to you? I go because everybody in the room is me. It's now a total community, because I believe that even in this wonderful country of ours, that anti-Semitism can be endemic. And it won't take very long for people to turn on us. So I believe by going to synagogue that I'm sitting in a room with hundreds of other people who are like me. And I find that very important at this stage of my life. And so I do it and love doing it. And now, it's also interesting that I always fasted on Yom Kippur, even though I never was part of organized religion. It was just something I felt that if you did that, that too was a part of being Jewish. And so I did it when I was a kid, and I still do it. I still do it.